My name is Yvonne Harper. I am 64 years old, a retired community nurse who spent decades caring for the sick and the forgotten in our small town. People used to call me steady, dependable, invisible in my sacrifices. I never minded that. For most of my life, I believed my purpose was to stand quietly behind the people I loved, to give until there was nothing left of me. Today I sit alone in a lawyer's office, leather creaking under me, the faint smell of polished wood and paper in the air. My fingers shake as I hold the document before me. It is the last will and testament of my late husband, Richard. He was my partner for 40 years, a man of few words but steady hands, a man who built a life for us brick by brick. And now, even in death, he has left me something I never expected. The words blur on the page, but I read them again and again to be sure. My late husband left me everything. The red brick house on the hill where we built our memories, his $2 million in savings, and the company he spent his life growing. For a moment, I feel both honored and crushed beneath the weight of it. All of this, in my hands, when my heart still aches from his absence. The door opens and the sound of footsteps drags me out of my grief. I turn and the air catches in my throat. Standing there is Daniel, my son, my only child. The boy I carried, the boy I raised, the boy who walked out of my life 2 decades ago and never once looked back. He has not spoken a single word to me in 20 years. Not one phone call, not one Christmas card, not even when his father was dying. And yet, here he stands, smiling as though time has not touched us, as though 2 decades of silence were nothing but a passing storm. He steps closer, his suit crisp, his shoes polished, his smile practiced. He places a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that once would have comforted me, but now feels like an intrusion. His eyes scan the document in my trembling hands, and he leans down, speaking with a confidence that chills my blood. "As your only son, I am in charge now," he says, his voice steady, his grin unshaken. My breath catches. For 20 years, I dreamed of hearing his voice again. I thought I would cry, or run to him, or hold him in my arms if that day ever came. But the reality feels like betrayal wrapped in silk. The words sting, not "I missed you," not "I am sorry," only "I am in charge now." As if my husband's death were a doorway for him to seize what he believes is owed. I cannot speak. My lips part, but no sound comes. The room spins around me. Then, before I can gather myself, another sound fills the air. The firm click of the office door opening once more. Mr. Howard Miller, my husband's lawyer, walks in. He has been with Richard for over 30 years, a man with hair the color of silver and eyes that miss nothing. He carries a thick leather folder tucked firmly under his arm. He nods to me, then glances at Daniel. In that instant, I see it. Daniel's smile falters. His confident stance weakens, and the color drains from his face. He turns pale, as if the ground beneath him has suddenly shifted. It is in that single moment I understand. This is not a reunion. It is not a son coming back to a grieving mother. This is an invasion, a performance staged to claim what was never his to begin with. The lawyer sets the folder down on the polished oak desk, his voice calm but commanding. My son lowers himself into the chair across from me, his hands gripping the armrests, his eyes darting toward the papers as though they hold both his salvation and his ruin. My late husband left me everything. My son, who had abandoned me for 2 decades, thought he could simply walk back into this office, into my life, and take control. But when my lawyer spoke, his face told me everything. The act was over. The truth was waiting to cut him down, and that, right there, is where my story begins. For 20 years, I prayed for Daniel to return. I begged God for even one more conversation, one more chance to be a mother. But sometimes prayers are answered in ways that break us further, only to force us to rise. So stay with me. What happened next is not just about money or inheritance. It is about loyalty and betrayal. It is about silence that cuts deeper than words. And it is about a woman who thought her life was over, only to discover a strength she never knew she carried. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted the most, you will understand my story. If you have ever wondered what forgiveness costs, or whether blood alone makes a family, you will find yourself in these words. So listen closely, because I am ready to tell you everything. I remember the last words my son ever spoke to me before he left. He was 20 years old, his face flushed with anger, his fists clenched as though he was ready to fight the entire world. We had been arguing about his future. Richard wanted him to finish college, to take responsibility, to build something steady. I only wanted him to be safe, to choose a path that would not consume him. Daniel wanted none of it. He stared at me with eyes so sharp they cut deeper than any blade, and he said, "I do not want to live a boring life like you, Mom." Then he slammed the door so hard the walls shook, and just like that, he was gone. That sound, the echo of the door closing, still haunts me. It was more than wood on metal. It was the sound of my son severing ties with me, of a bond snapping after 2 decades of sacrifice. I stood there, frozen, unable to breathe, hoping he would come back through the doorway with tears in his eyes, telling me he did not mean it. But hours passed. The sun went down. The house grew darker, and the silence settled in like an unwanted guest who never leaves. That night, I sat by the window, waiting for the familiar sight of his shadow on the porch. I kept the hallway light on, like a beacon calling him home. But the only thing that came was the ticking of the clock in the living room. Each tick felt louder, crueler, reminding me that time was moving forward without him. The next morning, I wrote him a letter. My hands trembled as I put pen to paper. I told him I loved him, that arguments happen, that he could always come home. I mailed it to the last address I had for him, praying he would read it, praying he would feel the warmth of my words. Days turned into weeks and there was no reply. So I wrote another letter, then another. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the ink smudged from my tears. Every envelope was stamped. Every envelope disappeared into the mailbox, and none of them came back. It was as though my words had been swallowed by a void. The house became unbearable. Daniel's room stood untouched, his posters still on the wall, his books still on the shelf, the blanket folded at the foot of the bed. I would open the door sometimes just to breathe in the faint trace of his cologne, but it faded with each passing month. The silence in that room was deafening. It pressed against my ears until I thought I might lose my mind. Richard tried to stay strong for me. He buried himself in work, coming home late, his face weary and lined. At dinner, we would sit across from each other, chewing in silence, both pretending that we were not listening for footsteps that never came. Some nights I would hear Richard in the garage, pounding nails into wood with unnecessary force, his way of drowning out the pain. I prayed every night. I prayed Daniel was safe. I prayed he would pick up the phone. Each ring of the telephone made my heart leap, but it was never him. Bill collectors, wrong numbers, occasional calls from friends, never Daniel. I began to dread the sound of the phone because it reminded me that I was still waiting for someone who would not come. Holidays became the cruelest reminders. I set the table for 3, out of habit, only to remove the extra plate before Richard sat down. Christmas lights twinkled on the tree, but they only illuminated the empty chair where Daniel used to tear open gifts with laughter. Birthdays passed, and I baked cakes I could not eat, slicing them into neat pieces and leaving one untouched, hoping he would walk in and claim it. I wrote him again when Richard fell ill, this time pleading. "Your father is sick," I wrote. "Please, if you ever loved him, come home." I mailed it with shaking hands, staring at the mailbox as though my desperation could somehow carry it faster. But weeks passed. Hospital visits grew longer. Machines beeped in sterile rooms, and Richard's hand grew weaker in mine. Still no word. Not even when I told him his father was dying. When Richard took his last breath, I felt something inside me collapse. I looked at the empty doorway, praying Daniel would appear, even at the final moment. But it was just me, Richard, and the hum of hospital machines. I buried my husband alone, and my sons. Absence felt like a second death. For 20 years, the house was my companion. Its walls absorbed my sighs, its floors creaked under the weight of my loneliness. The ticking of the clock grew louder, as though mocking me. Every letter I sent was a message in a bottle cast into an ocean that never gave anything back. People said time heals, but they were wrong. Time does not heal. It stretches the wound, turns it into something deeper, something permanent. The silence between a mother and her son is not just empty space. It is a canyon, wide and endless, and it echoes with everything left unsaid. That was my life for 20 years, waiting, praying, writing, hoping, and hearing nothing in return, until the day of the will reading, when the silence was finally broken. Before the will reading, there were the years with Richard, and they anchor everything I am. He was not a poet or a charmer. He kept time with a wristwatch and a route sheet, came home with grease under his nails, and believed love is proven by roofs that do not leak and cars that always start. He could be stern, sitting at the table with a ledger to say no when sentiment begged yes. Yet he was faithful, steady as the stone edging our garden. Every Saturday he walked the yard with pruning shears, moving slow and exact as if the roses required a surgeon. He wore the same faded denim shirt, cuffs polished smooth by time. When he finished, he brought a bloom into the kitchen, set it in a chipped glass, and nodded toward it like a confession. I washed dishes with the scent of cut petals in the air and understood that some promises arrive without ceremony. We were not glamorous. We were constant. We rose before dawn for coffee, read the paper, and left the radio on during supper so the house would not feel too large. When money ran tight, he patched tires, sold old tools, and refused to touch the savings he had marked for my later years. When storms peeled shingles, he climbed into the rain and made it hold. He rarely said, "I love you." He always warmed my gloves in January. After Daniel left, our marriage felt like a boat in rough water. Some nights we drifted in separate rooms, grief moving through the hallways like a tide. Yet every Saturday the rose returned to glass, and every Sunday he straightened the cross on the mantel, as if repairing symbols might keep the world from breaking. He did not speak of our son. He knew how to show up. A man can say, "I am here," in many quiet ways still. The year the cough began, it sounded like a winter cold would not surrender. He called it dust from the warehouse. I pretended to believe him. He kept working while doctors drew blood and made images, then used words that landed a verdict. Nights grew long. I pressed cloths to his forehead and lined pills in a row, the way I had done for patients who were not my husband. The timer measured doses. The wall clock became a nurse. I wrote to Daniel again. I wrote carefully, not accusing and not pleading, letting the facts stand clearly. Your father is sick. He asks for you. There is time if you come now. I mailed the letter and waited near the window as if the mailbox might argue back. The days answered for him. Silence is a language. Once you learn its grammar, you cannot pretend you do not understand. Richard watched me fold a letter and asked if I wanted him to sign it. I shook my head. It mattered the words be mine. He cleared his throat and said he did not want me to carry this alone. That night, when pain pressed him, he reached for my hand and squeezed, strength he could not spare. Yvonne, you are the foundation. He said it, and it settled into me like a beam laid. Weeks narrowed into measurements, milligrams, milliliters, minutes. I learned to count breaths. I learned the pattern of his sleep and the twitch in his jaw that meant another wave was coming. On good mornings, he insisted on the garden. I brought the shears and steadied his elbow while he trimmed a rose with ceremonial care. He placed the bloom gently in my palm. His hand trembled. The petals did not. I wrote to Daniel again after a night of alarms and oxygen. Your father is failing. He wants to hear your voice. I gave the phone every chance to ring. The house kept its discipline. Tick, tock, breathe, turn. Sometimes I raged, winter, thunder, asking what kind of son abandons his father on the long road. Then I felt ashamed of the question because it carried an answer I had learned. Not every child returns. Not every story offers repair. Richard grew smaller. The man of tires and roofs became bones and breath. I told him the weather, the headlines, the garden's progress, because ordinary news can be a rope when the cliff is near. He listened with half-closed eyes and squeezed my fingers when I mentioned the rose. I could see the apology in his face for the burden my days had become. I answered it with tea, with clean sheets, with the steady ministry of tasks, and with the patience that years had trained into my bones. When doctors advised us to prepare, he asked for one favor. He wanted the house in order, the accounts labeled, the keys hung on the hook we had used when Daniel was small. Even then, he thought of my steps after his last one. We walked the rooms. He pointed. I nodded. And in each doorway, I felt his love built into angles like wood hidden under paint. On the last Saturday, he could stand. He sharpened the shears and placed them in my hands. Your hands now, he said. The funeral was quiet, almost too quiet, like the world had lowered its voice out of respect for Richard. We chose a small chapel on the edge of town, where the pews were old, but the windows caught the morning sun just right. Only a handful of people came, some neighbors, a few men from the trucking company, and 2 nurses from the clinic where I had worked. They stood in silence, nodding to me, whispering prayers as if their words might keep me upright. I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the polished wood of Richard's coffin. The roses I placed on top were the last ones he trimmed in the garden, their petals already fading at the edges. I tried to listen to the pastor's words, but my mind wandered, catching on small details. The creak of a pew, the cough of an old man in the back, the echo of shoes against stone. All of it felt too ordinary for something as extraordinary as losing him. I kept glancing at the doorway. Part of me, foolish, stubborn, still hoped Daniel would walk in, even if it was only for the final goodbye. I imagined him standing there, his shoulders broad, his eyes soft with regret. But the doorway stayed empty. Each minute without him was another confirmation of the truth I had been trying to deny. My son was not coming, not for his father, not for me. When the service ended, people filed past, offering condolences in gentle tones. They said things like, "He was a good man, and he loved you dearly." I nodded, thanked them, but inside I felt hollow. I returned home to the house that now belonged only to me, and the silence was louder than it had ever been. The days that followed blurred together. Morning coffee without Richard tasted like water. The radio we used to play sat in silence, dust collecting on the dial. I wandered through the house, touching his shirts, his books, his glasses folded neatly on the nightstand. At night, I pressed my face into his pillow, searching for the scent of him, finding only the reminder that time erases everything, even the trace of those we love. 3 weeks passed in this fog. Then one morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, the name of a law office printed across the corner. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was an invitation, a formal notice to attend the reading of Richard's will. The words hit me like a stone dropped into still water. I had known, of course, that this day would come. Richard was a careful man. He prepared for everything. But seeing it written out, the last will and testament of Richard Harper, felt like a line I was not ready to cross. It was final, undeniable. He was gone, and now his voice would return only through legal papers and signatures. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread before me. The house was dark except for the light above my head, casting long shadows across the room. I stared at the words until they blurred. Fear crawled up my spine. What if I could not manage everything alone? What if the company collapsed under my watch? Richard had been the anchor. Without him, I felt like a boat, unmoored, drifting. I whispered aloud, "How will I do this without you?" My voice cracked in the empty room. No answer came, only the steady ticking of the clock, relentless and indifferent. Part of me wondered if Daniel would somehow appear at the will reading. Perhaps news of his father's death would finally reach him or stir something inside him. The thought twisted in my chest. Would I welcome him if he did? Could I? For 20 years, I had longed for his return, but grief had changed the shape of that longing. I was no longer sure if I craved his presence or feared the hurt it might bring again. Sleep did not come easily. Each night I turned restlessly, thinking of ledgers, property, responsibilities I had never handled alone. Richard had always been the shield. Now I was exposed. The company's trucks still rolled down highways, employees still depended on paychecks, and the house still demanded upkeep. It was all mine now, and I was not certain whether it was a gift or a burden. The morning of the reading, I dressed carefully, as if Richard could see me. A navy suit, plain but respectful. I pinned my hair back, though strands fell against my temples. In the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were rimmed red from nights of crying, but beneath the exhaustion was something else. Determination, maybe, or the faintest ember of strength. I folded the letter, slipped it into my purse, and stood in the hallway. The walls seemed to breathe around me, filled with the memory of a man who had built this life with his bare hands. I touched the door frame gently, whispering, "I will try." Then I stepped outside into the cool air, my heart heavy, my hands unsteady, not knowing that the moment I walked into that law office, my world would tilt again, not because of what Richard left me, but because of who would show up to try to take it away. The law office was quiet when I arrived, its heavy oak doors shutting behind me with a dull thud that echoed in my chest. The receptionist guided me into a conference room lined with shelves of old legal volumes. The air smelled faintly of leather and dust, and the table in the center gleamed under the overhead light. I sat alone at one end, clutching my purse as if it were an anchor. The notice of Richard's will reading lay folded inside, and my heart pounded with every tick of the clock on the wall. I had braced myself for the loneliness of this moment, convinced no one would stand beside me. Richard was gone, and Daniel had abandoned me long ago. But when the door creaked open, I froze. There he was. Daniel stepped inside as if he owned the place, his suit sharp, his tie knotted perfectly. His face had aged, of course. There were lines around his mouth, shadows beneath his eyes, but his smile was exactly the same. The confident, charming grin he used to get away with everything as a boy. For a moment, I could hardly breathe. "Mom," he said warmly, spreading his arms as if to embrace me. "It's been too long. 20 years, reduced to 2 words spoken so easily it made my stomach twist. He crossed the room without hesitation, leaning down to place a hand on my shoulder. The touch was unfamiliar, foreign, as though he were no longer my son but a stranger wearing his face. "As your only son, I'm in charge now," Daniel declared, his voice smooth, steady, rehearsed. He said it with a smile, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. My chest tightened. In all the nights I had prayed for his return, I had imagined so many possibilities. An apology, a tearful reunion, even anger would have been easier to bear. But this, to have him return not out of love or grief, but out of entitlement, it felt like a knife. I stared at him, unable to speak. Words caught in my throat, trapped beneath years of silence and longing. My hands trembled in my lap. He sat down across from me, leaning back in the chair with an air of possession. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll handle everything. The house, the money, the company. You don't need to concern yourself. You've done enough. Done enough." The phrase rang in my ears like a verdict. Did he mean enough as in sacrifice or enough as in control? I could not ask. My lips would not move. Then the door opened again. Howard Miller entered, the lawyer who had been with Richard for more than 3 decades. He was a tall man with hair silver as frost, his presence calm but commanding. He carried a thick leather folder under one arm, and his eyes sharpened as they moved from me to Daniel. Daniel's posture stiffened. The smile on his face wavered just slightly, but I saw it. His confidence cracked for the briefest moment, a flicker of unease slipping through. His skin paled, the color draining as though he already knew what was inside that folder. Howard nodded politely to me. "Mrs. Harper." Then he turned to Daniel with a measured look. "Mr. Harper." The air in the room shifted. What had felt like Daniel's stage suddenly became something else entirely. My son's grin did not vanish, but it faltered, and I saw his jaw tighten. Howard set the folder down on the table and adjusted his glasses. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Richard Harper," he began. His voice was steady, deliberate, each word falling with weight. I looked at Daniel. For the first time since he had walked into the room, his eyes darted away from mine. His hand tapped against the armrest, restless, betraying the calm he tried so hard to project. I sat up a little straighter, the tremor in my hands slowing as I realized something I had not felt in a long time, the ground shifting in my favor. Howard opened the folder, pulling out the first pages. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to confirm that both parties are present." Daniel cleared his throat and answered quickly, "Of course. I'm here to represent the family's interests." The word "represent" stung, as though I, his mother, were not family enough, as though he alone carried the right to claim Richard's legacy. But Howard gave him no acknowledgement beyond a nod. His gaze returned to the papers, his tone firm. I folded my hands on the table, the ache of grief still heavy in my chest, but something else sparking underneath, a quiet strength. I did not know yet exactly what Richard had prepared, but I could sense it. My husband had always been deliberate, and Daniel, for the first time, seemed uncertain. That moment was a turning point. The confident boy who had stormed out 20 years ago was no longer in control. His smile had cracked, his face had paled, and the balance of power was shifting. I took a slow breath, bracing myself for what was to come. Howard did not sit. He remained standing as if the words required height. He drew the first page from the folder and spoke in the steady cadence of a man who has watched families rise and fracture across this table. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Harper," he said. "I, Richard Harper, being of sound mind, make these bequests." His eyes lifted to be sure we were listening. Then he read the language that would untie the knot my heart had lived inside. "To my beloved wife, Yvonne Harper, I leave all real property, including the residence on Pine Hill, all bank accounts, cash, and investments, totaling approximately $2 million, and full ownership of Harper Transit Company, together with all rights, licenses, contracts, and goodwill." The list kept flowing, precise and final. Everything routed to me, no carve-outs, no second thoughts. Daniel exhaled through his nose. The sound was small but sharp, like a match striking. He leaned forward as if nearness could change the letters on the page. "That cannot be the whole of it," he said lightly. "There must be responsibilities to consider. A company requires leadership." Howard turned another page. "There is a clause of special concern," he said. "If any heir by blood or marriage contests or obstructs the execution of these bequests, the entirety of my estate shall, without delay, be conveyed to the Harbor Home Foundation for abandoned children. It is my intention that my wife be free of coercion. Challenges will terminate all private inheritances." The room stilled. The clock's hand swept and seemed to hesitate. Color retreated from Daniel's face. The confidence he wore slid out of alignment. "He would not threaten his own son," he said. The words landed softer than his posture meant them to. Howard removed a sealed envelope from the folder. The paper was thick, the flap closed with a line of red wax. He set it in front of me. "Your husband asked that this be read if Mr. Harper returned," he said. My fingers did not move at first. Then they did. I cracked the seal and unfolded a single sheet, the ink a familiar press of his careful hand. "Yvonne," it began, "if you are hearing this, our boy has found his way back to your chair. I wish the reason were love, yet life has taught me to prepare. You have spent our years holding a roof above people who forgot to look up and see you doing it. You are the foundation of this house and of me. What I have built is yours, because you built me. If Daniel appears, hear me clearly. You owe him kindness if your heart can spare it, but you owe him nothing he did not earn. Choose the path that keeps you whole. Choose yourself without guilt." My mouth opened without sound. The letters wavered. The table swam. I read the lines again because I needed them to fasten inside me. You are the foundation. You owe him nothing. A tide I had carried for 20 years stepped back. Daniel shifted in his chair. "Mom, listen," he began, reaching a hand across the table as though we were restarting a conversation paused yesterday. "Dad must have written that during a bad spell. He did not mean for you to handle all of this alone. He knew I could help." I folded the letter on its crease and held it with both hands, as if it might fly if I loosened my grip. I did not look at Daniel. I looked at the handwriting that had steadied our bills and the notes he left on Saturday mornings beside cut roses. I felt something inside my chest click into place, a quiet alignment that did not need volume to exist. Howard spoke again, his tone respectful. "Mrs. Harper, we can proceed with formal transfers. There is nothing further required of you today." He gathered the will and the inventory, but left the letter with me. He understood what mattered. For years I had craved one sentence more than any apology, a sentence that said the life I lived had weight. In that room, with my son's breath uneven across the table and my husband's words lifting me under the ribs, I received it. Tears came, not loud, not shaking, but the kind that move like rain through ground prepared for it. I did not hide them. I let them travel. I kept my voice still because the weeping was its own language. Daniel sat back, palms open in a practiced display of reason. "No one is trying to hurt you," he said. "This is about practicality, succession, responsibility." I slid the envelope into my purse and closed the clasp. My hands had stopped shaking. For the first time since the hospice nurse folded the last sheet, I felt taller inside my skin. "I heard your father," I said quietly. My voice did not break. "So did you." Howard closed the folder with a soft final sound that felt like a door meeting its frame. The cliff that had opened when he entered widened into ground I could stand on. I lifted my chin, not in defiance, but in acceptance of what had already been true. I had carried this family through storms. Now the paper said what the roses said each Saturday without words. I was the foundation, and the house still stood. The will reading ended with the sound of papers sliding back into Howard's folder, but Daniel was not finished. He lingered in the hallway, smiling as though none of it had unsettled him. "Let's have dinner, Mom," he said smoothly. "We have so much to catch up on." I wanted to say no, to retreat into the safety of silence, yet a part of me, perhaps the same part that once set an extra plate on the table every Christmas, agreed. We chose an Italian restaurant Richard had loved for its quiet booths and good bread. When I arrived, Daniel was already seated, a bottle of wine breathing on the table. He rose with exaggerated politeness, pulling out my chair as if we were strangers on a first meeting. "You look well," he said. "Strong. I always knew you'd manage." The words were sweet, but the tone carried something rehearsed. I studied him while he spoke, the way his fingers drummed the table, the way his eyes searched the room before settling on me. He was selling something. I could feel it. He poured the wine into his own glass and lifted it. "To Dad," he said solemnly. I nodded, but kept my water untouched. At first, the conversation fluttered with small talk. He asked about the garden, about neighbors I barely saw anymore, about whether I still attended church on Sundays. I answered with short sentences, letting the silences stretch. He filled them eagerly, as if afraid of my quiet. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, softer. "I made mistakes, Mom. Walking away was selfish. I was young, angry, and I thought I knew everything. I regret that now." The words should have pierced me, but they slid across the surface. He had rehearsed this too. His eyes did not carry the weight of real remorse. They carried calculation. Still, I let him continue. "You shouldn't have to bear all of this alone," he added gently. $2 million, the house, the company. Dad left so much. It's overwhelming for one person, especially at your age. There it was. The pivot. His hand brushed the table as if steadying me. "I want to help. Think of it this way. I'm not taking anything from you. I'm just stepping in where you need support, managing accounts, overseeing the company. You can focus on your health, your peace of mind." My fork rested untouched beside my plate. I kept my gaze on him, watching the flicker in his eyes each time he mentioned the money. The pauses between his sentences were too measured, the regret too polished. He sighed dramatically. "I miss Dad's last years, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But maybe this, helping you, could be my way of making amends." I let the silence settle between us. I did not nod, did not smile, did not answer. I sipped my water slowly, the glass cool against my hand, and placed it down with deliberate calm. His words tangled in the quiet I left behind. He shifted in his seat, leaning closer. "Look, Mom, I know what Dad said in that letter, but he was sick, tired. He didn't want you to struggle. Be reasonable. $2 million is not easy to handle. People will come after you, try to take advantage. Let me protect you." Protect me. The irony curled in my chest. The boy who had vanished without a word now painted himself as my shield. I watched his mouth shape the lies, and for the first time I felt no ache, only clarity. The waiter arrived with our meals, placing steaming plates between us. Daniel smiled, thanked him, and then turned back to me with practiced sincerity. "This pasta is just like when you used to make spaghetti on Sundays. Remember? You always overcooked the noodles, but Dad and I never said a word." He laughed softly, trying to stir nostalgia. I twirled the pasta on my fork but did not eat. My silence became heavier, sharper, and I saw him begin to fidget. He wanted me to interrupt, to ask, to forgive. Instead, I observed, calm and unmoved. Finally, he exhaled, impatience slipping through the cracks. "Mom, we need to be practical. Why don't you let me take over the company accounts, just temporarily? I'll make sure everything runs smoothly. You can live in peace, without stress." I laid my fork down carefully, folded my hands in my lap, and met his eyes. I said nothing. The power of that nothing filled the space more than any argument. He swallowed, his smile faltering for the first time since the evening began. "Are you angry with me?" he asked, voice softer, unsure. I lifted my glass again, took a slow sip of water, and placed it back on the table. Still silent. He leaned back, forced a laugh that sounded hollow. "You've always been stubborn. Fine. We don't have to decide tonight, but think about it. It's too much for you alone." I let the quiet answer for me. The truth was written in his face, the cracks showing in his performance, And for the first time in 2 decades, I realized the silence he had given me could be returned, wielded not as a wound but as a shield. The night after dinner with Daniel, I could not sleep. His words replayed again and again in my mind, the soft apologies that carried no weight, the quick pivot to money, the suggestion that I could not manage on my own. I lay in the dark house, staring at the ceiling, feeling Richard's absence press against me like a heavy blanket. When the clock struck midnight, I rose. My feet carried me down the hall to Richard's study, the room he always called his office. I had not entered it much since his death. The scent of him still lingered there, old leather, faint tobacco, the sharp tang of ink. His desk sat under the window, neat as always, papers stacked precisely, pens aligned. He had been a man of order. Even in chaos, he created rules. I sat in his chair and let my fingers drift across the surface. My hand paused at the top drawer. I pulled it open, stationery, envelopes, paper clips. The second drawer, folders of company contracts, tax forms, nothing unusual. Then my eyes caught the faint outline of a keyhole in the bottom drawer, one I had never noticed before. I searched the desk, pulling at small compartments. Finally, behind a row of ledgers, I found a brass key. My hand shook as I fitted it into the lock. The drawer resisted at first, then clicked open with a reluctant groan. Inside lay a thin folder labeled in Richard's handwriting, "Personal." I lifted it out carefully, my heart pounding. The first papers were bank receipts, large sums transferred quietly over the years. Every slip bore Daniel's name, thousands of dollars at a time, dates that spanned more than a decade. I flipped faster, bile rising in my throat. While I had been writing unanswered letters to my son, Richard had been sending him money. But it was not the support I first imagined. Behind the receipts were reports, neat packets stamped with the letterhead of a private investigator. I scanned the pages, my eyes blurring. The reports chronicled Daniel's life: casinos, poker tables, bars, records of debts left unpaid, landlords chasing rent, friends betrayed. My son had burned through the money as quickly as it arrived, gambling it away, sinking deeper each year. There were photographs, too. Grainy images of Daniel at card tables, Daniel stumbling out of late-night bars, Daniel arguing with men in dark alleys. The investigator's notes described dangerous associates, patterns of compulsive risk, no evidence of rehabilitation. I pressed the pages flat against the desk, trying to steady them as my hands shook. The worst blow came at the back of the folder, a letter written in Richard's hand, never given to me. It was addressed simply, "For Yvonne, if I cannot explain." My eyes blurred as I read. "My dearest, I know you long for Daniel to return to us. I know your heart waits at the window for him. I chose silence to protect you from the worst of it. He is alive but lost to choices I cannot repair. I have sent him money, hoping each time it might turn him steady, but he throws it away. I hired an investigator when fear for his safety grew. The truth is darker than I wished to tell you. He has debts, habits, shadows that would break your heart. I could not burden you with this while you cared for me. Forgive me for holding back, but I needed you to stay strong, not crushed under knowledge you could not change. If one day you learn all this, remember, you are not to blame. He walked his own path. You carried enough for us all." I sat frozen, the letter trembling in my hands. Richard had known. For years he had carried the truth alone, shielding me from it. He had watched me write those letters into the void, let me believe silence was rejection rather than destruction. He had borne my sorrow in silence, never breaking, never confessing. A sob rose in my chest, but it did not escape. It pressed against my ribs, heavy and sharp. Betrayal and love tangled together. Betrayal that Richard had hidden the truth, love that he had done it to spare me. I felt the weight of both, pressing from opposite sides until I thought I might split in two. I spread the receipts, the reports, the photographs across the desk. My son's life lay before me in fragments, each page a cut. The boy I once rocked to sleep, the boy who slammed the door with cruel words, the man who returned smiling with empty apologies, all of it now framed by proof of choices I could not deny. The house was silent but for the tick of the clock. I pressed my palms against the desk and bowed my head. For the first time, I did not picture Daniel as a lost child returning. I saw him as a man who had built his absence, brick by brick, until the wall between us could no longer be crossed. The folder lay open, undeniable. Richard had known. And now, at last, so did I. 3 days later, I found myself walking into Howard Miller's office again. The same polished oak table, the same leather chairs, the same shelves stacked with law books that smelled faintly of dust and authority. But this time, I was not alone with Howard. Daniel arrived flanked by a man in an expensive gray suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. His stride was brisk, his handshake firm, his voice smooth with practiced assurance. "Harris," he introduced himself, looking directly at Howard, barely glancing at me. "I represent Daniel Harper in this matter of estate division." Daniel sat down confidently beside him, his jaw set as though this were a negotiation he was certain to win. He avoided my eyes, but I studied him closely. There was a tightness in his expression, a twitch at the corner of his mouth that betrayed nerves beneath the show. Howard folded his hands on the table, calm as ever. "Gentlemen," he said, "we can proceed, though I should remind you this estate has already been lawfully transferred." Harris smiled politely, the kind of smile lawyers use when they think they've already cornered you. "We are here to contest the fairness of that transfer. As Mr. Harper's only son, Daniel has a natural right to inheritance. The size of this estate makes it unreasonable to expect one widow to manage it alone. It is both practical and just that Daniel assume co-ownership." I felt Daniel's words from dinner echoed in Harris's argument. Practical, reasonable, just. The language of manipulation dressed as logic. Howard did not flinch. He opened the leather folder in front of him, sliding out several sheets of paper. "Your argument might hold," he said evenly, "if there weren't already provisions in place. Richard Harper anticipated this possibility." Daniel leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You can't deny blood. I'm his son. That should count for something." Howard's eyes flicked to him briefly, then returned to Harris. "It does count, which is why your father recorded certain things that I am obligated to share now." From the folder, Howard withdrew a small black recorder. He pressed a button, and the room filled with Richard's voice. My breath caught in my chest. "Howard," Richard's voice said, steady but weak with illness. "If Daniel ever tries to contest this will, you must remind him. I sent him money, thousands over the years. I gave him chances to stand on his own. He gambled it away, betrayed my trust, and left his mother to suffer in silence. This estate belongs to Yvonne. She is the one who carried this family. She is the foundation. Daniel forfeited his right through his choices." The words hung in the air like stone. Daniel's face drained of color. He opened his mouth as if to object, but no sound came. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his polished confidence faltering. The recording clicked off, and the silence that followed was louder than any argument. Howard let the quiet settle before speaking. "In addition to this recording, I have bank receipts and investigator reports confirming every transfer of funds, every debt incurred, every misuse. If this matter goes before a judge, the record will be clear. Daniel Harper was given ample provision, and he squandered it." Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "That's not fair. I was young, I made mistakes, but I'm still his son." Howard's voice remained calm. "And your father remained your father. He gave you chances, he forgave debts, he offered help, but he also made a decision at the end of his life. That decision was final, and it was legally sound." The room was still. I could hear the faint ticking of Howard's desk clock, the soft hum of the air conditioning. I looked at Daniel, my son, my flesh, the boy I had carried, and the man who now sat across from me like a stranger on trial. My heart ached with an old, familiar pain, yet alongside the ache was something new, something I had not felt in years: peace. For the first time, I was not questioning myself, not wondering if I had failed him. Richard's voice had given me the truth, and the truth was a strange kind of mercy. Daniel finally turned to me, his eyes flashing with desperation. "Mom, you can't let them shut me out. Tell him you need me." I met his gaze steadily. My lips parted, but I did not answer. Silence was my shield, my answer louder than any plea. Harris cleared his throat, clearly unsettled. "It seems, Mr. Harper, that contesting this further could expose you to legal liabilities. I recommend we reconsider." Daniel slumped back in his chair, fury and shame mixing on his face. His bravado had cracked, and beneath it was the boy who had walked away 2 decades ago, still unwilling to face himself. Howard gathered the papers calmly. "This matter is concluded. The estate belongs solely to Mrs. Harper. Any further disputes will activate the charitable clause, and there will be nothing left for you to claim." I sat straighter, feeling the weight of Richard's words still pressing against my heart. Foundation. That is what he had called me. For years I had doubted, wept, begged for Daniel's return. But in that silent room, I understood. I was never empty. I was enough. The silence stretched on, a verdict in itself. The day after the confrontation with Daniel and his lawyer, the house felt heavier than usual. The walls seemed to carry echoes of Richard's voice from the recording, and the silence that followed me from room to room was no longer a wound but a mirror. I carried the folder of receipts and reports upstairs, setting it on Richard's desk, though I could not bring myself to open it again. That afternoon, Mrs. Bentley arrived. She had worked in our home for more than 15 years, a quiet woman with silver hair tucked beneath a scarf, her back straight despite age. She'd been Richard's housekeeper before she became mine, though I never thought of her as just that. She was a witness to our lives, present in the rhythms of our household, dusting shelves, arranging flowers, humming softly as she ironed shirts. She came into the kitchen with a grocery bag balanced on her hip. "I brought you some soup," she said, setting it down. "You look like you need to eat." I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that acknowledges kindness without the strength to answer it fully. We sat at the table, bowls steaming between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Mrs. Bentley folded her hands, her gaze steady on me. "You know," she said gently, "Mr. Harper talked about you often when he thought I wasn't listening." My spoon paused halfway to my mouth. "He did." She nodded. He'd sit in that armchair by the window, rubbing his temples after a long day. Sometimes he'd sigh, and I'd ask if he wanted tea. He'd say no, then mutter about Daniel, about how disappointed he was, about how angry he felt at himself for not guiding him better. But then, every time, he'd say the same thing. "Yvonne is the only reason this house hasn't fallen apart." The words landed deep. I blinked back the sting in my eyes. He never said that to me. "Men like him don't always say what they should," she replied softly. But he believed it. He told me more than once that you were his true foundation, that no matter what Daniel did, you were steady. He worried, though. He worried that if Daniel ever came back, it wouldn't be for love. It would be for what he could take. I drew a slow breath, pressing my fingers to the rim of my bowl. He was right. That's exactly what happened. Mrs. Bentley reached across the table, her hand light but firm on mine. "You gave your son everything a mother could. That bond should have been unbreakable, but sometimes blood ties fray when character does not hold them. Richard knew. He told me once, 'My wife carries both of us.' If Daniel betrays her, she'll stand taller than me because she always has. Her words broke something in me, not with pain, but with release. For years, I had felt the weight of failing as a mother, believing Daniel's absence was punishment for something I had done wrong. But here was truth, reflected in someone else's eyes. I had been the constant. I had been the one who stayed. "Do you think love can disappear?" I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Mrs. Bentley shook her head. Number love changes shape. A mother's love doesn't vanish, but it learns boundaries. Richard's love for you never wavered. That's why he left everything in your hands, not just the money, the trust. He knew you wouldn't squander it. He knew you would guard his name, even when his son would not. The silence after her words was thick, but not heavy. I felt something loosening in my chest, like a knot finally unraveling. I looked at her, this woman who had dusted our shelves and folded our laundry, and realized she had also carried pieces of our story in ways I never knew. She had been a mirror to Richard's unspoken devotion, and now she became a mirror to my worth. I whispered, "I spent 20 years waiting for Daniel's return. But the one who never left me was Richard, and I see that now." Mrs. Bentley's eyes softened. Sometimes it takes losing what we thought we needed to see what we already had. Her words settled into me with the quiet certainty of truth. I understood then that while motherhood had left me scarred, marriage had given me strength. Daniel may have broken the bond of son and mother, but Richard had honored the bond of husband and wife until his last breath, and that bond, though invisible, held me upright still. We finished the soup in silence, but it was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of understanding, the kind that does not need to be filled. When Mrs. Bentley left that evening, I stood at the doorway watching her walk down the path, her figure small against the fading light. The house behind me no longer felt empty. It felt like it held a truth I could finally carry. That night, the house was wrapped in silence, the kind that presses against the walls and settles heavy on the chest. I sat alone in Richard's study, the lamp casting a narrow circle of light across the desk. In front of me lay the pair of pruning shears he had sharpened and placed in my hands on his final good day. The steel glimmered faintly, the handles worn smooth by his grip. I picked them up, running my fingers along the metal, and felt the weight of them as if they were more than a tool. They were a symbol, the baton he had passed to me when he could no longer stand among the roses, a reminder that I was expected to carry forward, even when the garden felt too large for my hands. My reflection flickered in the window, superimposed over the dark night outside. I studied it as though I were meeting a stranger. The lines around my eyes, the gray at my temples, traces of years lived and endured. I whispered aloud to the empty room, "What kind of mother have I been?" The question circled back like an echo. For decades I had measured myself against Daniel's absence. A mother who loses her child to silence cannot help but believe she has failed. Had I been too stern? Too yielding? Did I press him to follow Richard's order when he longed for freedom? Or did I let him go too easily, believing he would return when he was ready? The shears rested in my lap. I turned them over slowly. Richard's voice came back to me in fragments. "You are the foundation. You owe him nothing." Yet motherhood does not release so easily. Blood is stubborn. It whispers duty even when reason shouts, "No." I closed my eyes. I could still see Daniel's smile at the restaurant, the calculated softness in his voice when he said he regretted leaving. For a moment, part of me had wanted to believe him, to pretend those words came from love rather than greed. But then I remembered the reports, the receipts, the photographs. I remembered Richard's letter, the truth he had shielded me from. Still, the ache would not let go. I asked myself, if I refuse him now, am I betraying my role as a mother, or am I finally honoring it by setting a boundary? The moral weight pressed heavy. Mothers are taught to forgive, to hold the door open no matter how many times it is slammed in their faces. Society praises the endless sacrifice, the love without limits. But what if that love becomes a weapon in the hands of the unworthy? What if forgiveness feeds destruction instead of redemption? I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The shears felt cool against my skin where the handle touched my palm. Richard had trusted me with more than property and money. He had trusted me with discernment, with the strength to choose when to hold on and when to let go. Was I wrong to say nothing, to sit in silence across from him? I murmured. Should I have shouted, begged, pleaded for him to change? Or was silence the truest answer a mother could give to lies? Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I did not weep fully. Instead, I let the questions wash over me, heavy and unresolved. Perhaps there was no clean answer. Perhaps motherhood itself is a paradox, boundless love balanced by necessary limits. I looked again at the shears. They were meant for pruning, for cutting away what threatened the health of the plant, so that what remained could grow stronger. Richard had known that. He had taught me that in his quiet, steady way. And now, the question became whether I was willing to prune my own life, to cut away even the branch I had once cherished most for the sake of survival. The night deepened. Outside, the garden lay in shadow, the roses asleep. I imagined walking among them, scissors in hand, trimming the dead stems, leaving space for new blooms. I imagined myself as one of those roses, my roots firm in the soil Richard had prepared, my petals opening to the future rather than clinging to what had already withered. I whispered one final question into the silence. If I forgive him, will it heal us, or only break me further? The house gave no reply. The only answer was the steady tick of the clock and the weight of the shears in my hands, and perhaps that was enough. The knock came late, sharp against the quiet of the house. I knew before I opened the door who it would be. Daniel stood there, his shoulders stiff, his jaw tight. Gone was the polished smile from dinner. Gone was the polite son rehearsing apologies. His eyes burned with frustration, and his voice cracked with fury the moment he stepped inside. "Enough games, Mom," he spat. "I need money, 100,000, right now." I froze, the hallway light spilling over his face. His demand rang through the house like a gavel. "I'm drowning," he continued, pacing, hands clenched. "You sit here with $2 million in the bank, a mansion, Dad's company, and I have loan sharks breathing down my neck. You owe me this." I held my breath, my fingers curling against the banister. "Owe you?" I repeated softly. He turned on me, his voice rising. "Yes, you owe me. You let me walk out that door. You didn't chase me, didn't fight for me. You abandoned me as much as I abandoned you. You sat here with your roses and your silence, while I learned the world on my own. You owe me because you chose him over me." The words sliced deep, but I stayed where I was, the ache pressing against my ribs. "You were supposed to be my mother," he shouted, fists slamming against the wall. "And what did I get? Rules, lectures, cold stares? Dad always knew I wasn't like him, but you could have loved me anyway. Instead, you let me rot. Now you have the money, and you're telling me I don't deserve it. You're telling me I'm not your son." I did not move. Silence stretched between us, thick as stone. His breathing came ragged, echoing through the hall. I let the weight of that silence press down, let it tell him what words could not. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my eyes to his. My voice was low, steady. "You had 20 years to call me. One call, one letter, one knock at this door. You did not." The room stilled. He blinked, his lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came. The fury in him faltered for a beat. I stepped closer, each word deliberate, like a blade pressed gently to skin. "I wrote you letters when your father was sick. You never answered. I begged you to come back before he died. You never came. 20 years, Daniel. 20 years and nothing but silence. You chose that silence, not me. My chest rose and fell with the heaviness of it. For a moment, I thought I might collapse under the truth spilling from my mouth, but instead I felt lighter, stronger. He clenched his fists again, his voice breaking into a growl. I had my reasons. I shook my head. Number you had excuses, and now you want money to fix the wreckage you created. That's not what fathers and mothers are for. That's not what family is for. The words hung in the air, final and undeniable. His anger simmered, but behind it I saw something else. Fear. Daniel's fear did not last long. He straightened, forcing steel back into his voice. If you won't help me, he said, his tone low and dangerous, then maybe people need to know the truth about Dad, about what kind of man he really was. My body stiffened. He smirked, mistaking my stillness for weakness. I'll tell the papers he gambled too, that he hid money, I lifted my hand slowly, pointing toward the corner of the hallway. His words faltered as he followed my finger. There, barely visible in the dim light, a red dot glowed on the security camera Richard had installed years ago. It's still running, I said softly. It records every word, every threat, every lie. The color drained from his face. He stepped back, his bravado cracking, his eyes darting toward the door. You wouldn't use that against your own son. I kept my voice calm, even, deliberate. You already did that to yourself. The silence that followed was electric. For the first time, I saw him falter completely. His shoulders sagged, his breath came fast, and the mask he had worn since walking back into my life slipped away. Gone was the confident smile, the polished charm. What stood before me was a man cornered by his own choices. I folded my arms, not in anger, but in resolve. This house is protected, Daniel. I am protected. And if you think threats will bend me, you have forgotten who raised you. I endured your absence. I endured your silence. I endured burying the only man who ever stood beside me. Do you think I cannot endure this too? He swallowed hard, the fury in his eyes replaced with panic. His gaze flicked again to the glowing red dot. Every second that passed, the power drained from him, flowing into me instead. This is your last chance, I continued, my tone quiet but sharp. Walk away before the world sees you for what you've become. Walk away before you burn the last bridge still standing. For a long time, he said nothing. His jaw worked, his fists clenched, but his eyes betrayed him. He was afraid. Not of me, perhaps, but of the truth he could no longer twist. Finally, he muttered, "This isn't over," though his voice cracked with doubt. I stepped closer, my eyes level with his. "It is over. You ended it the moment you turned your back 20 years ago. All this time, I blamed myself. But tonight, Daniel, I see it clearly. You chose this path, and now you must live with it." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was freeing. The house no longer echoed with his anger. It carried only my calm. He backed toward the door, one hand on the knob, eyes darting nervously at the camera once more. Then he slipped out into the night, leaving the house quiet again. I stood in the hallway, the glow of the camera steady above me, and let out a long breath. For the first time in decades, I did not feel like the weak one in the room. The power had shifted, not because I shouted, not because I fought, but because I stood still, because silence, when wielded with truth, is stronger than rage. Richard's words returned to me. You are the foundation, and I believed them. After Daniel stormed out that night, I stayed awake long, after the house had fallen quiet. The echo of his accusations clung to me, sharper than the memory of his footsteps fading down the drive. He said I had abandoned him. He said I owed him. His words stirred a pain I had carried for 20 years, the ache of wondering if I had failed as a mother. I walked slowly into my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, beneath neatly folded quilts, lay a small wooden box Richard had carved for me on our 10th anniversary. Its surface was worn smooth, the edges rounded from years of being handled. I lifted it into my lap, my hands trembling as I undid the clasp. Inside was my secret. Stacks of envelopes carefully tied with faded ribbon. Some yellowed with age, others still crisp, each bearing the same name, Daniel Harper. Letters written in my hand, sent across the years to addresses I managed to find through whispers, old contacts, and sheer hope. I picked one up, the ink smudged where my tears had fallen long ago. The words returned to me even before I opened it. Dear Daniel, I miss you. Your father is working hard, but he asks about you every evening. Please, just write back. Tell us where you are. Tell us you're safe. Every letter had come back. Some stamped return to sender, some unopened, some with new addresses scribbled out, replaced by the Postal Service's cold black ink. Not at this location. Each envelope was a small funeral, a reminder that my love had traveled the miles only to be refused. I traced the edges of the stack with my fingers. 20 years' worth of letters. Proof that I had not abandoned my son, not even for a season. I had reached for him again and again, through grief, through illness, through nights of silence when Richard slept beside me. I had never stopped trying. No one knew, not even Richard. I could never bring myself to tell him how many times I wrote, how many envelopes I slid into the postbox with prayers stitched into every line. He knew of some, yes, but not the hundreds. The truth was that even as Daniel ignored me, even as my letters returned like echoes, I could not let go of being his mother. I lifted the bundle and pressed it to my chest, my breath caught, heavy and uneven. I never stopped looking for you, I whispered into the quiet, even when you stopped looking for me. The house held my confession. The wooden box bore silent witness. This was the truth no one would ever guess, that while Daniel lived his life in noise and chaos, I carried a quiet ritual of hope. I searched for him in every envelope, and he had chosen silence. For the first time, the tears came freely, not of guilt, but of release. I had not failed. I had not abandoned. I had tried until the very world itself told me to stop. The failure was not mine to carry anymore. I closed the box gently, returning the envelopes to their place. They would remain part of my story, but no longer as chains. They would remind me of my love, not my loss. The following weeks passed with a quietness I had not known in years. Each morning I walked into the garden, pruning shears in hand, tending to the roses Richard once cared for. I cut away the dead branches, cleared space for sunlight, and watched as new buds dared to form. In every trim, I saw a reflection of my own heart, letting go of what no longer gave life. One evening, as the sun slipped low, I sat in Richard's study and stared at the stack of documents Howard had left. Deeds, accounts, company shares. The weight of them was immense, but no heavier than the wooden box I had carried in secret for so long. For decades, I had poured love into someone who refused to receive it, and now I realized I had a choice. I could keep waiting for Daniel, or I could plant my love where it might grow. The decision came quietly but firmly, like dawn after a long night. I called Howard the next morning and told him what I wanted. Together we began the process of establishing a foundation, the Richard and Yvonne Harper Fund. Its mission, to support children abandoned or forgotten, to provide scholarships, counseling, and safe homes. The kind of lifeline Daniel had refused, but countless others would embrace. As I signed the papers, a strange warmth filled me. For the first time in years, my energy was not spent on waiting for what might never come. It was spent on building something new, something good. Richard's legacy would not be tarnished by threats or silence. It would bloom in the lives of children who still believed in love when the world had told them otherwise. The staff at the community center we partnered with welcomed me with gratitude. I met young people whose stories mirrored pieces of my own. A girl who kept checking the mailbox for letters from a mother who never wrote back. A boy who clung to the memory of a father's voice he barely remembered. In their eyes, I saw my younger self. In their smiles, I saw a future I could help shape. I told them once quietly, family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is the ones who show up, who stay, who keep their promises. As the weeks turned into months, the foundation began to flourish. Donations flowed in, programs expanded, and my days filled with purpose. I no longer sat by the window waiting for Daniel's return. I walked into classrooms, hospitals, and community halls, carrying roses from my garden to remind the children that beauty could survive pruning. One evening, I stood in the garden at dusk, the air scented with blossoms. The pruning shears rested in my hand, the roses glowing in the fading light. For the first time in years, I felt light inside myself. I was no longer bound by unanswered letters or hollow promises. Richard's words came back. You are the foundation. And now I believe them with my whole heart. Daniel's absence would always ache, but it no longer defined me. I had turned that ache into something living, something that breathed. I was not just surviving, I was blooming. And perhaps that was the truest inheritance of all. The morning sky was pale gray when I walked up the path to the cemetery, roses from my own garden gathered in my arms. The air was crisp, sharp enough to sting my lungs with every breath, but I welcomed it. The silence of the place wrapped around me, heavy yet comforting, as though every stone carried not just grief, but also the quiet dignity of remembrance. Richard's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, its branches bare in the winter chill. The headstone was simple, just as he had wanted, carved with his name and the years of his life. I knelt down slowly, placing the roses against the base. Their red stood out fierce against the cold stone. Beside them, I set down the pruning shears, polished and sharp, the ones he had left in my care. My hand lingered on the metal, my reflection faint in the steel. I whispered softly, blood is not a right. It is only an opportunity, and some opportunities are lost forever. The words carried into the air, sinking into the quiet ground around me. They were not angry, they were not bitter. They were simply truth, the kind I had fought for years to accept. Daniel had been given the opportunity to be my son, to be Richard's heir, to be part of our lives, and he had chosen otherwise. Love cannot be forced where it is unwelcome. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I felt Richard beside me, the steady presence, the quiet strength, the man who had called me the foundation. My heart eased, as though he approved of the way I had carried forward without him. Rising to my feet, I brushed the damp from my skirt and looked out across the rows of graves, life and death, beginnings and endings, all bound together in the soil. What mattered most was not the blood that tied us, but the choices we made with the time we were given. I walked back toward the gate with my head high, no longer bowed by guilt. The ache of loss would remain, but it no longer defined me. I had chosen to plant my love where it could grow, in the children who welcomed it, in the foundation that bore both Richard's name and mine. I had chosen to live forward, not backward. As I stepped onto the path home, I turned my thoughts outward, to those listening now. Perhaps you have known the weight of silence, the ache of waiting for someone who never came. Perhaps you have questioned, as I did, whether love means forgiving endlessly, or whether love sometimes means protecting yourself. Tell me, what do you think? Was I wrong to let silence be my answer? Was I wrong to draw the line where Daniel could not cross? Or was it the only way left to preserve what dignity remained? If you have ever walked this road, I would like to hear your story. Leave your thoughts in the comments because no one should carry such questions alone. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, and in second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you, and I hope you remember, sometimes the miracle does not knock loudly at your door. Sometimes it waits quietly, patient, until you are ready to open your heart. Take care, and I will see you in the next story. The screen fades, not with music, but with silence. The kind that lingers, the kind that lets the truth settle.